Thank you ever so much, George, and the Mental Health Research Matters team, and McPin and Mental Health for coordinating this really fabulous webinar this evening. I'm really quite excited to hear the talks and listen to you all and hear your questions as well. I have been involved in research for 20, 30 plus years and have been involved in various research projects which are interdisciplinary by their very nature in the past. And even now I'm involved in several projects and networks, including March, that is one of the UKRN networks, BioAirNet, which is another UKRN network, nothing to do with specifically mental health. I'm trying to transform it into mental health. Attune and Synergy, all of these have been very interdisciplinary, and I've really enjoy the interdisciplinarity. It's exciting, but it's challenging. It's where I learn most, but it's also where I have to sit and listen hardest to really understand concepts that are being proposed by other people. And it is the solution to solving the mental health conundrum, how we provide better care, better support, better treatments, because knowledge is socially distributed in so many different disciplines and siloed. So it's one of our challenges. So I hope this seminar this evening will be exciting for you. There are 4 networks represented today: March, eNurture, Emerging Mind, and the Loneliness and Isolation Network. The programme broadly will begin with 3 brief provocations from 3 distinguished presenters, some of whom I've worked with, some not. And then we'll take a little bit of time to have a free-floating discussion and ask each other questions and generate some reflections. Following that, there'll be some lightning talks where we'll have 4 or 5 presenters also from the networks. And what we want to do there is to draw your attention to asking questions. What drew you to mental health research? What are the biggest challenges working in this way? What are the top tips? You'll hear some of the top tips, but you may have solutions yourself. So you do use the chat function and the Q&A function, both of which will be working. You won't be able to ask questions directly, but we will try and pick up important questions in the chat and try and address some of them. The program's quite packed, so it does mean that we're going to have to be quite disciplined about sticking to the schedule and moving on through the various items. But we hope, I certainly hope we'll be able to take some time and go at a slow thinking pace rather than a fast thinking pace in some of the work that we're going to do this evening. And it will be work. I mean, we will be tired by the end of it, and it will be challenging, but we're all going to be much better nourished and ready for dinner afterwards. So to start with, the first section is on an interdisciplinary research panel, 3 amazing people to present. The first is Nicholas Shaughnessy, who's Professor of Performance, School of Arts at the University of Kent, with whom I've got the great pleasure of working on the Attune project, and I've learned so much already in a few months. Sylvan Baker, who I had the pleasure of working with at QMUL and is on the Restart UKRI project, Senior Lecturer in Community Performance, Applied Theatre and University of London. And I've heard Sylvan speak before, and it's amazing TED Talks and amazing presentations. And Kat Sebastian, who's the Head of Evidence for Mental Health at the Wellcome, who has an incredible responsibility for thinking about how to generate evidence and promote the implementation of the evidence, not just the generation of the evidence and so forth. So the order is going to be Nicola, then Kat, if that's okay, and then Sylvan. And Sylvan's going to have a free-floating response to the provocations earlier on. So without further delay, Nicola, if I can hand it over to you, please.
Thank you, Cam, and thanks for inviting me. I'm not sure if I'm here as an unusual discipline or as someone with a reputation for working differently, but I'm hoping to address the brief to offer a provocation alongside some tips and tricks. So first slide, can you all see my slides? Because I can't. Oh,
they're on. Yeah.
They're on. Okay.
1 second, I just need to get yours up. Bear with me.
Okay. Great, brilliant, thank you. So yeah, keep that slide there. So I've been working in the interspace between arts and science for the last 12 years, mostly on projects exploring autistic identities and experiences through participatory arts, and mostly in collaboration with psychologists. Imagining Autism was focused on autistic children aged 7 to 12 in special educational needs settings. Playing a Part addressed autism and gender, working with teenage girls and women. And I'm currently part of the project that Cam mentioned, Attune, exploring adverse childhood experiences and adolescent mental health, also using creative practices and lived experience to co-produce new knowledge and resources through interdisciplinary methods. So my title, Scientists and Artists in Their Pyjamas, comes from a blog written by one of the co-investigators for Playing a Part, Dr. Emma Williams at the University of Surrey. The full blog can be found on the Playing a Part website. And if I can have slide 2, Pyjama Thinking. Her blog refers to her experience of one of the first sessions at a school for autistic girls, where she completed a series of interviews and then joined the creative practitioners and participants to experience a workshop. And it's important to say that this was very different to the way that we worked in Imagining Autism, where the psychologists asked to be blinded to the creative methods. Because that ended up with the psychologists then asking to be unblinded as the data started to emerge, and they needed to know what we were doing, we approached the project very differently when we did Playing a Part. And it actually ultimately became very important that Emma had this experience, as her blog describes. So for Emma, there was a light bulb moment when she realised the difference between the girls she had interviewed and their engagement and behaviour in the workshop activities. She says, "The girls were so much more alive in the workshop. I was astonished. It was the difference between a butterfly flying freely, engaging with its environment, and a butterfly pinned to a specimen board." She was acutely aware of her habitual stance as an observer, seen as essential to psychology to remaining objective. Quote, "I realised that in the course of doing the interviews, the essence of the girls had been lost somehow. I was left asking, is it possible to get a bit closer to capturing the free butterfly in flight in the interviews?" In an effort to do this, the interviews adopted some of the exercises used in the participatory arts workshops, such as asking the girls to complete a sensory mind map, whilst getting them to open up about how the world looks, sounds, tastes, smells, and feels to them. Crucially, for my purposes, Emma concludes, "So by now, you might be wondering why I have identified myself as a psychologist in her pyjamas. What has that got to do with learning to work in the arts-science interspace?" Well, it was only by physically changing my habitual workspace and clothes that I felt freed up enough to write this blog. I needed to be physically divested of my usual habits, to be different and outside of my usual self. It feels challenging and uncomfortable, which perhaps in itself has brought me just a little bit closer to understanding the experiences of the autistic girls themselves. End quote. So this got me thinking about how working in interdisciplinary ways moves us beyond our comfort zones. In my experience, the moment the research territory becomes challenging, we retreat into our disciplinary costumes, which protect us, for example, as artists or scientists. If I was to do a discourse analysis of recent cross-disciplinary discussions of how to do coding of data produced through creative practices, the apologetic and self-invalidating language from the practitioners would be dominant, yet the insights and rich data produced are a strong endorsement of the approach. Practitioner perspectives have been a blind spot in arts health research, and perhaps we need a pyjama-wearing perspective to enable more comfort between these disciplinary bedfellows. So what do the pyjamas represent? An in-between state between sleeping and waking, private and public, and vulnerability, as they're also associated with childhood, illness, and self-care, and they are liminal. So my tip, wear your pyjamas to do interdisciplinary thinking. And a trick, which is how I start training sessions on neurodivergence, is to put your shoes on the wrong feet to feel different and experience the world differently. Slide 3, please. Changing the terms of the conversation. So being willing to learn a new language is a prerequisite to interdisciplinary research. And a new language means a new vocabulary or a medium for sense making and knowledge production. We need to consider how we talk about these terminologies and the differences between disciplines and cultures, and to question some of our assumptions about the objective stance and the values associated with subjective experience, being attentive to voice in data and the gaps and blind spots created by the decisions we make about who is included, how data is processed, and by whom. I hear a lot about the importance of evidence-based practice, but what I produce and advocate for is practice-based evidence in conjunction with this, not as an either-or. These are productive tensions that need sensitive negotiation, and they're the reason why we're here today to talk about why we need to do things differently. Slide 4. So this slide shows an image that was posted on Twitter last week after I spoke on Radio 4 about my own mental health experiences. It reminds me of the way my autistic son writes and draws to process his thoughts. Not quite as sophisticated as in this beautiful example, but there's an insight in this image to a different way of being in the world. It's effective and it's rich with meaning. The responses to the interview were overwhelming and took me by surprise because of the abundance of messages from researchers referring to the new knowledge and understanding generated by this experiential narrative. Slide 5. The messages included an email from the parents of a young woman who died, aged 33, due to misunderstanding, miscommunication, and misdiagnosis. Their daughter suffered the consequences of the blind spots we create through the categories we construct and the paradigms we work within. In this case, and in many others, mental health challenges are a consequence of being neurodivergent. This young woman was diagnosed as autistic only 2 years before she died. I did not have her permission to create this slide, and I wondered about the ethics of doing it, although all this information is very much in the public domain, as her parents wanted her story to be told. Slide 6. So arts practices offer ways of creating new knowledge through new kinds of data. And so this is my pajama dreaming of arts and science enriching each other. The 3 R's in this context are how the arts are used in terms of representation of lived experience, reparation through creative therapies, and realization through their potential to transform mental health research and practice. And 2 of the tools that I'm finding useful are on that slide: framework analysis and life worlds fractions. But new tools are needed for these acts of translation. And this brings me to the final slide, and lessons from the neurodiversity movement and its impact on autism research. In the 2022 annual review for the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, Liz Pellicano's editorial is entitled "Shifting from Normal Science to Neurodiversity in Autism Science, an indication of the paradigm shift the field is experiencing." In the case of autism, it's unusual because of not having a phenomenology. This is due to the history of the diagnostic criteria and the association with young children, most frequently boys, many of whom have high levels of need, so can't talk about their experiences. This history has also contributed to the underdiagnosis of autistic girls and women and the need for more awareness of the intersections between neurodivergencies and mental health. An enlightened psychiatrist, Professor Jonathan Green, is working with autistic adults to address this gap. He refers to an amazing paradigm shift and suggests the understanding coming out of it is going to be staggering for medicine. He is initiating interdisciplinary discussions of a scaled up phenomenology investigation that puts lived experience center stage, co-producing something that is rigorously scientific and which could inform the professional and research communities. So that, for me, is the future thinking needed. And those involved will need to be willing to wear pajamas. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. That was just amazing. So tempting to start discussing it, but we won't. We've got to keep to a time. So if I may invite Kath Sebastian to come in and load her slides. And you mentioned so many disciplines there and so many challenges. Are you ready, Kat? Slides are just coming up. Bear with us. We can't hear you, Kat, if you're...
Sorry, I was just struggling to unmute. Can people hear?
Fabulous. No worries.
Okay, I'll get started.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm here to give a funder perspective to think about how the actions of a funder can promote multidisciplinary research in mental health. And we're very much at the beginning of this journey, so just want to start with that caveat. I'm going to give a few examples of what we're starting to do, and then also talk towards the end about the limitations of what a funder can and can't do. So first, I just wanted to give a bit of background about Wellcome and our new strategy, which has at its heart the intention to create integration across research areas. So as has been a strength of Wellcome in the past, there's a very strong theme of discovery research. So research, basic research in any discipline that can shift our understanding of human health. But on top of that, there are 3 health challenge areas which Wellcome really wants to focus on. And these are infectious disease, climate and health, and mental health. And as you can see from this infographic, the research programs are designed to be porous so that we can collaborate with each other in designing new ways of funding. And examples of how I and the mental health team have started to collaborate with other areas include we collaborated with the discovery research team to fund the Born in Bradford Age of Wonder adolescent cohort with a specific focus on mental health. And we're also collaborating with our climate and health team to promote some global dialogues on the overlap between climate change and mental health, and how that's going to be a particular challenge facing mental health in the coming decades. But what about the mental health team in particular? What are we doing to try and promote interdisciplinary research? So our overall remit is to fund research which helps us to understand anxiety, depression, and psychosis, but also to intervene, and in particular to try and prevent or intervene early in the development of these symptoms. But in order to do that, we've explicitly said that we need to build the field of mental health science and to make it more interdisciplinary and to break down some of those silos. As Nicola mentioned, the language barriers that make it so difficult for us to work together. So as part of our team, we also, as well as the sort of core funding teams, we also have a field building team whose remit is specifically to build mental health science as an interdisciplinary field, and also a lived experience team, which we very much see as at the heart of our work and at the heart of building an integrated mental health science field. I'll give a few examples of the kind of work that we're doing. The first example is we've taken a very sort of standard funding call, which is a sort of bread and butter of what we do. But I've listed a few examples of how we can use funding call design to try and promote interdisciplinary working. So this example is our mental health award. It's called Looking Backwards, Moving Forwards, Understanding How Interventions for Anxiety, Depression and Psychosis Work. And so what we're trying to do with this call is to take interventions that we know are at least moderately effective and work out how they're actually working, for whom they're working, in an effort to try and better refine and target these interventions. And what we've tried to do is explicitly encourage team science. So we want teams of between 2 and 8 applicants, ideally comprising a diverse and multidisciplinary group. Also in the remit for the project, we favoured multidisciplinary work. So we've explicitly said that teams should investigate how interventions work at different levels of explanation or scales of analysis, right from molecular to cellular, neural behavioural, right through to social determinants. As I mentioned before, lived experience is a key part of our remit, and this call is no different. So we have as a key criterion for assessment that lived experience is woven throughout the design and implementation of the project. And in addition, we are interested in taking a portfolio approach. So we're looking for breadth across the research that we fund, as well as interdisciplinary working within projects. So although the funding is still in progress, and I can't tell you yet which applications we're going to fund, we very much hope that we will receive we have received a range of proposals which are in assessment now, which do span all levels of explanation from the molecular through to the social. The second example I'll give is where we've decided to take a novel funding approach. So funding call is very typical for us. We're now experimenting with using a data prize model, or you may know it as a data challenge. And this is very common in industries such as tech, but for mental health, this is relatively novel, and indeed it was new to me. Essentially, a data prize, and a good analogy is like hosting a dinner party. So you take a much more active role in the prize, and you provide the data relevant to solving the problem, and you define the question that you want answered. And then you invite participants with different skills and take a matchmaking role, facilitate interactions, and form multidisciplinary teams. And then you provide incentives and support, networking, mentorship throughout the challenge in order to create an enjoyable, facilitative environment. And what we've done with the Wellcome Mental Health Data Prize is, again, this is a collaboration across teams within Wellcome, our Data for Science and Health team, and mental health. And then we further teamed up with an external partner, Social Finance, who have expertise in partnering across different domains and who could help us curate the data that we wanted to be analysed. And we wanted people to focus on a dual challenge. So to really promote this interdisciplinary working, we wanted them both to focus on a research output, so the sort of mental health research side. And that's around understanding what works for whom and why in terms of interventions for anxiety and depression in young people. But then we also wanted people to focus on a data science output, so focused on developing digital tools that would help the research community for future research. So this really had kind of multidisciplinary working baked in. And we ran the prize in both the UK and South Africa, following a scoping phase of where there would be appropriate data. And I'm pleased to say we've recently funded 10 multidisciplinary teams for stage 1 of the prize. Oh, sorry, actually that's wrong. There are actually 11 teams in the end. And we were really pleased with the standard of the applications and saw that the applicants were excited to embrace the opportunity to think in a more multidisciplinary way. And just as a couple of examples, one project at the University of Edinburgh really brings together researchers across mental health, but also humanities, to assess the impact of reading for pleasure in young people, but also to create a digital tool for assessing the effectiveness of an intervention. And then we were also pleased to see that it wasn't just universities applying for this prize. We also had charities, and we funded Black Thrive to run a project to combine data from the UK Police's Stop and Search database with mental health measurements to both highlight the impact of stop and search on mental health, but also to create a resource highlighting differences across different locations. So finally, my third example is led by my colleague Niall Boyce, who heads up the field building team, which I mentioned earlier, within mental health at Wellcome. And this is an effort to try and support transdisciplinary research that really helps us to learn from outside disciplines that are traditionally associated with mental health science, so outside psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. And this is motivated by the idea that we can learn from thinking in a completely new way by taking innovative ideas from other disciplines. An example that Niall often gives is the recovery trial for different medications to target COVID-19 introduced rapid and adaptive trial designs, which we haven't particularly used within mental health, but could well have applications that could speed up discovery research in mental health. So this is an open commission. So if anyone is interested in applying for this, the deadline is 2nd of December. What Niall is doing is looking for an external supplier to support and convene 5 to 10 experts from outside of mental health. So at the moment, we're at the stage of commissioning a supplier for the work, and then later will come the opportunity for experts to apply for whatever funding model results. And the overall aim is to produce literature reviews that apply knowledge from outside the field in ways that can potentially improve what we do in mental health science. And so if you're interested, please do check out the link. So just to finish, what have we learned so far? Can I be at all provocative here? I think it's worth saying that mental health itself is very broad, and it can be an achievement even to bring together traditional mental health disciplines. You know, even psychiatrists and psychologists don't always speak the same language, let alone cellular neuroscientists. But we can't stop there. We need to learn how to communicate with disciplines completely outside what is traditionally thought of as mental health science. One thing that we've found is that it is difficult to encourage all forms of diversity at once. So one thing we found with the data prize, for example, was that by focusing on discipline diversity and mandating that we have data scientists working with mental health scientists, it was more difficult to encourage geographical diversity, and applicants in South Africa struggled to meet that brief. So we're interested in working with them further to try and understand how we can help to get that geographical diversity back in. I hope that I've demonstrated a little bit how funding models can be used to request changes from the field about how we work. But it can't be the only solution. There has to be the will from the field and also the infrastructure on the ground. And just to add that we are very much at the beginning of this journey, and we're interested in learning along with the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Again, amazing amount of work. It's easy to underestimate how much work's gone into shifting opinions and attitudes and shifting structures and reorganizing everything that you do. And right from your opening slide, you know, the biology linked to environment, linked to mind, revolutionary in the past, extraordinary that you moved so quickly, actually, and not something that I think people would associate with a welcome, but it's incredible. Thank you so much for that. Our final speaker in this section is Sylvan Baker. Sylvan, over to you. You're going to start the provocations and bring them together a little bit for us to chew on in a moment.
Thanks very much, Cam. I hope everyone can hear me. My interesting role in this webinar today is to have provocation, which is a response, I guess, if I'm looking at it in that way. And it comes out of a range of observations and experiences of working in interdisciplinary ways in science and mental health science and a range of other areas. I am, I guess, if I'm being categorized, an applied theatre researcher and practitioner. And for those maybe unfamiliar with that discipline, my shorthand for it when asked about it at dinner parties, when someone asks me what I do, I would tend to say that it's drawing on theatrical and performance techniques and practices, but not applying them in anything that looks like a theatre or performance space. And it's a discipline with a long and varied history. And I think one of the reasons why it might be of use and efficacy in this idea of interdisciplinary scientific working is that it's a discipline that's light on its feet. It's a discipline that is used to not setting up the context or the environment in which it works. And at its best, it's a discipline which I can define or describe as being a little bit Zen-like. And I say that without a real deep understanding of what Zen might be. And I think why I say that is because as a practitioner, sometimes arriving at the beginning of a study, colleagues and participants may approach me and say, so what are we going to do? What's it going to look like? And my seemingly bland response is, I don't know, because we won't know until we kind of start. And that's where maybe the Zen comes into it. So some provocative thoughts. that were buzzing around my head as I was listening to the two fantastic presentations before me. Things that we need to think about as practitioners and scholars, researchers who want to work together. There are varying and sometimes contradictory understandings of what participation means. And revisiting that idea of, if you are going to work alongside others, what kind of participation you are looking for, I think is fundamentally important. Asking those questions which can have a slight tang of passive aggression about them are questions like, we've done this, we want you to look at it, I hope that's okay. Those people who are looking at whatever that is are already drawn out of the process. If that's okay means that ultimately there's an inference that the decisions have already been made. So I would offer an idea that I discovered in applied theatre, but I don't think it sits there. And that's an idea that is around an understanding of a concept called co-intentionality. And for me, co-intentionality is really that whomsoever is working, from whatever disciplines they are in, has an agreed understanding on what the outcome is. Put another way, that's, we know where we're getting to, but we don't know how we're going to get there. Now, the thing about co-intention is, it sometimes is misdefined as being co-delivery or co-design or some other kind of co. That's not to denigrate those, but it's to say that I think co-intentionality is a vessel in which all of these things sit. The idea of co-intentionality at its core means that there is space and freedom, risk, and generosity for people to be able to admit to each other that they don't speak the same language, to be able to share with each other that they don't understand the points of views or the perspectives of those that they are working with. Because I think what's required for us, if we're going to be as successful as we can be in working with those with lived experience or working with those whose disciplinary trappings are completely alien to us, is to maybe develop a kind of interdisciplinary Esperanto, a kind of way in which that we can derive a language which is suffused with the knowledges of all the people who are taking part in it, but allows us to be understood by one another, allows us to, sorry, that's the alarm I set for myself to make sure that I didn't overrun, that allows us to not try and transform one form of understanding into another, but to develop new understanding, which is a melange of all of the things that are taking place. If only we had more time, eh?
If you wanted to talk for another minute or two, I'm sure that's fine.
Another minute, okay, that's great. So now I'm dancing, moving on my feet as I'm used to as a practitioner. I think what I wanted to mention was that there is a way of thinking about the creativity that goes into the work that we do differently. It's really interesting, and it's one of the things that's in a piece of research that Nikki and Cam and I are engaging in together, about really re-articulating what's going on when we are making research practices and processes. I would argue that what goes on in a rehearsal room and what goes on in a laboratory are incredibly similar, but are described in different ways. And once that general understanding is offered and challenged and reflected on, it means that the way in which practitioners and researchers can work together becomes richer and deeper. This richness, this depth, this nuance is really fundamental, because the areas that we want to study and the interventions that we want to make are as rich and deep as nuanced. And if we don't make responses that are aware of that situation, again, the chances of them being optimal starts to diminish. That was my extra minute. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Tom. That's just amazing, really amazing. So we've got some time now to have a little bit of conversation between ourselves. And I'll start just by trying to pull some thoughts together from what I've heard. I was really struck by the pajama metaphor, really, because there's so much in there that we could unpack to do with intimacy and humility and vulnerability and trusting each other, the relationship, and the absence, I guess, of a threatening power structure around you, because you wouldn't be in your pajamas if that were the case. And actually, I think all of you have spoken very, very eloquently about working in a different way, in a quite a courageous and intimate way, and almost, again, I like all of this sort of emphasis on really being in the world in a way that you don't usually live in the world, that you actually try to get out of the way you're usually operating and trying to find a way of being in the world together, and really notice who you are and what you do and what's happening. And that's what it appears practice allows us to notice, reveal the hidden, reveal the unknowns. And so Zen also then speaks to that in a way as well. I'm surprised none of you mentioned power, really. Maybe it's a dirty word, and as soon as you start talking about it, it triggers a sort of reaction we don't want to be involved with. But obviously there are lots of people who are marginalized and get very upset about the failure to provide systematic help and care and support treatments. And as a community, we're constantly feeling we're failing, really, to do what we should be doing. So they're my preliminary thoughts, and there's a lot more. And oh my gosh, I think we could carry on talking for the rest of the evening and a few days as well, just on your 3 talks. But what are your thoughts and reflections on each other's talks and presentations?
See how we were all incredibly polite there and all waited.
Is it? But I mean, that's a really important point because you talked a bit about challenge and asking difficult questions, and the need to be able to do that comfortably. So go for it.
I think power, as I see it, power was eminently evident in everything we were talking about by its absence. In a way, I think one of the things I heard in what Kat was talking about, and what this wonderful pajama metaphor, Nikki, will stay with me, is ways to subvert power. Again, when talking about applied theatre practice, I talk about it and characterize it as an insurgent practice, one that sneaks in the cracks, doesn't play by the rules, and is guerrilla, punk, under the radar, you call it what you will. And I think it does that, or aims to do that if it's doing it well, because that subverts power hierarchies and structures. Because one of the things that I was, again, struck by in Kat's presentation is the intersectional nature of the challenge that we have here, and how, if we're going to be truly interdisciplinary, we have to also be intercategorical around that. And if we're not, then we're going to start hitting those bumps that we talked about. So yeah, we've covered a particular sub area of identity of those who experience oppression. And oppression is, again, a function of power. But if we look at them singly, then the others will sneak up behind us and stop us from doing anything.
Great. Nikki?
I had sort of few things about voice, which were linked to thoughts about power. I think there was a lot that was implicit about power structures in disciplines, and thinking about how the kind of reference that I made to the way in which arts practitioners perceive themselves in those conversations. But there are huge issues around how we treat voice, how we work with data, that I think is also really important. I loved the thing is, Sylvan and I work in the same field. We both work in applied theatre and go to the same conferences and have kind of almost grown up with each other. So we do speak similar languages, and actually we're now both working in contexts where we work with neurodivergent people and scholars as well, neurodivergent scholars too. So I think if I was on a panel with neuroscientists and psychiatrists, I might be feeling a lot more uncomfortable. But I'm actually on a panel with you, Cam, so that's okay. And yeah, I was amazed actually by the the presentation about the new Wellcome funding. That does look really, really exciting.
It looks amazing.
I speak as someone who has failed to get Wellcome funding in the past, but I won't hold it against the Wellcome Trust. But yeah, that does look like it's moving in a really important new direction, and those slides really resonated with me as well in terms of areas of importance and priorities. And particularly, I think what's running through everything is the attention to lived experience being at the heart of what we do. And I think I would just like to say one thing, though, that when we think about lived experience or talked about lived experience in research, there is still this tendency to think about the lived experience group as the researched, and to talk about this in terms of otherness, but actually researchers themselves can bring lived experience to the work that they're doing. And so I want to challenge some of those relationships between the researched and the researcher.
Yeah, I could agree more. I think if there is an habitual lean into the idea of treating those with lived experience in a testimonial and witness frame, we're not exploiting the opportunity of having that lived experience with us to the max. It's really interesting in Restart, we from the beginning, at my behest, from the beginning, we said that the participants working with us, who happen to be young people, are researchers. And just by posing that question, it starts to trigger ripple effects outside into the academy. When we come to publish in journals, and we said we want to have our researchers as co-authors, it triggers all sorts of questions. The questions that they ask of our other interdisciplinary academic colleagues about how and why they do their work triggers questions. Their presence at academic conferences, when they hear their identity being objectified and, in extremis, suffering the social violence of being turned back into research subjects, changes the way we do our practice. Kat, I'm just shutting up so that Kat, you have some time.
Yeah, no, I just completely agree with that. And my colleague Kate Martin, who leads the lived experience team, is, always emphasizing that, our lived experience experts must never be expected to share their story. And that's not why they're there. They're there because they've got specific expertise that can feed into every stage of the research process, from helping us to develop the scope for our funding calls, to helping the researchers with the design and the implementation of the research. So yeah, completely agree with that. I think just to come back on a couple of the points that have been made, I think the power one is really interesting, and it's interesting to reflect on that as a funder. I myself moved from academia to working for a funder, so I've seen sort of both sides of the equation, and that's quite common within funding. And it was interesting to see how I experienced that power on both sides. I think as a funder, we do have, power to shape the field in certain ways, and therefore a responsibility to do that in a way that is sort of equitable. But at the same time, as I alluded to towards the end of my presentation, that can only go so far. And I thought quite carefully how to word. I think I said that we can request certain things from the field, but we can't sort of impose that. There has to be sort of grassroots, on the ground drive towards interdisciplinary research as well. So it's sort of top down and bottom up.
And the skills, that's right, the skills required. I was going to come back at everyone and ask a question about what skills do you really need, to really do this well. But we'll come back to that at the end, because there's quite a few questions in the chat. But have a think about that. What is it that you would advise people they need to skill up on? Because if you haven't got those skills, you can't even understand the calls that you're putting out. You can't understand why they're being put out in that way. So there's a few questions in the chat. If I can start with one. Stigma. Do the panel think stigma is a key problem that interdisciplinary research can tackle by understanding humans at a deeper level? That's one question. There's a couple of others, but I'll pause there if you've got any reflections on that.
I think the answer to that question speaks, Cam, to what you're asking us to reflect on later. It's about the research and practice demeanor. It's about the research environment, because if there is space to accept that defining a research group as a pathology, or looking at looking quizzically, it's interesting, this conversation about neurodiversity, the last conference I went to that talks about this, it seemed to still be talked about within psychiatric circles anyway, in a slightly diffident and suspicious way. This just the idea of neurodiversity, let alone anything else. So I think we have to try and find a respectful space of honesty, because I think as a funder, you are setting the ecology, or you can be. And so the idea that you want to be agile and collaborative with researchers because you have the resources gives me hope, but you are setting the tone. In the way that researchers are hiding behind their partiality by pretending to be objective, even though they've selected what the research is going to be, funders are at the other end of that arbitrary binary, saying, well, it's a great idea, but we're not going to fund it, so it'll never happen, at worst. So I think we need to be honest about that. Stigma is one of those nuances, and the stigma is suffuses our custom and practice as research and in various interdisciplinary areas. Again, we just have to name that and know that.
So we will come up against it. It's about seeing it and dealing with it, as you said, right from the beginning, rather than waiting for it to pop up. A couple of other questions. I'm going to read these two out together because they are linked, I think. Can you please say more about how an arts-based approach can help different groups in the partnership, clinicians and service users, to acknowledge and subvert power? And possibly linked to that is, could you explain a bit more about applied theatre research that you do? How can it be used? And I'm not sure if that means how can it be used as instrumentally, which is kind of the opposite of what you really are proposing. You don't want it to be used in a sort of interventionist way, but it's an experiential way. But anyway, if you could think about those two questions, there's another one that's come in as well.
My short answer. So my neurodivergence means that I think very quickly and pull data together really quickly to answer. So that's why I'm like jumping in. So on the project that I'm deputy principal investigator on, Restart, I, as the applied theatre practitioner, one of the sort of long-running jokes around applied theatre is that it happens in a rehearsal room. You and the participants are in a circle, and you then play some games and do some other stuff and devise. The Restart is over a year old now. I haven't run a single what I would call drama workshop in the project at all. So what I mean is, let's think about what we mean by applied theatre practices. I think what I am doing is I'm bringing facilitative experiences and observation that I acquired through doing applied theatre and bringing them to the table as a researcher in an interdisciplinary study. So the questions I'm asking, the way I'm asking them, the space that I'm not holding, but the space that I'm pointing to that is being occupied by whomsoever, means that we're doing things differently. In essence, we took an idea that there was going to be a work plan, one of the work plans of the number of ones that you have in a research program, that was going to be about how we develop the young researchers. And the one thing I have contributed is I said, that's not going to work. Let's take that work plan out, turn it on its side, and put it all the way through all of the other work plans, like a skewer in a kebab. And then other metaphors are available, I'm sure. But so that way, it means that every work plan has that lived experience at its core in an authentic way. It wasn't we just checked in with. Actually, the young people are asking us why we're doing stuff that way, or what it might feel like to have their brain scanned, let alone what a brain scan image gives us as researchers, changes all of our responses to it and puts all of the researchers on the project in a different frame of mind if they are willing and feel safe enough and generous enough to go there.
This is really great to hear. Just because one of the things that often comes up as a critique in interdisciplinary grant proposals is that, are they truly interdisciplinary because you have a work package led by someone from one discipline, another work package led by someone from another discipline? To what extent are they actually working together, You know, are they even just carrying out their different work packages in parallel and not actually collaborating in any meaningful way at all? So I think that's a really helpful tip for those thinking about how to do interdisciplinary research, is to, I like the skewer analogy.
But also that also alludes to the fact that when you do get funding, and we know it's tough, you know, getting funding, and it can be oppressive, and certainly the lived experience experts working with us are astonished by the process we've gone through. We've protected them from it to some extent, you know, what we have to do each thing. There has to be some flexibility then post-award. It's amazing to see how many people now are permitting that and being very supportive. How many commissioners are supporting that and saying, we get it, this is difficult stuff, this is what you think you're going to do, and you might end up somewhere else, but that's okay. We're not going to say you're failing on the delivery. We want to learn what's going on and why things are changing. So that's really positive. That's completely in the welcome vision, you know, amazing sort of piece of work by your team, Kat, and delivery. A couple of other quick questions. We're running against the clock. I knew we would be, but there's a question which says, could funders, and I guess this means clinicians and researchers as well, think about the best interests of people, their happiness, rather in research, in funding, rather than being preoccupied by things like getting people back to work or instrumental outcomes which are of importance to the economy, policymakers, politicians, rather than how do we do research which really helps people? And I guess one of the things about research is those who really need it are underrepresented in research. How do we get them in there and enable them to have a good experience of it, but also really benefit them? That's a really tough question, I know, but any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Nicola.
Yeah, I'm just sort of tying two things together really in responding to that. But one of the things that has come out quite strongly from the Attune research, which is still at a relatively early stage, but is the importance of young people talking to people who share their experience, a kind of, we've got a sort of peer education model. We've actually got postdocs on the project who identify as autistic, who've then been and worked in community contexts with young people who are autistic, and that's been really important to those young people. There's a sort of role model there, and they feel that they're not being othered. I mean, it's kind of very important in terms of addressing stigma as well. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this now because I've lost. What was the question again?
It was how do you enable research to happen to help people be happy rather than think about capitalistic machinery?
That's right, and they've talked a lot because it's mental health research. They feel that they are being approached because of having particular experiences that are defined as problems. But actually, through the research process and the researchers that have worked with them, they've been able to talk positively about neurodivergent identity, and they're using terms such as empowered. So that's where I was, that, you know, when you said the thing about happiness, that's where I was going with that.
Great. And another quick question was, how do we do mental health research that really matters? Another big question, but any kind of reflections on that?
I think I'll try my additional response to what Nikki just said and answer that question. The research that I'm in is called RESTAR, and RESTAR is an acronym that is regulating emotion, strengthening adolescent resilience. When I came onto the project, the resilience was already shouting alarm bells to me, because in my head, I had a very neoliberal reading of resilience. Let's make you stronger so that we can crap on you from above a little bit harder and you don't crumble, was kind of my shorthand understanding of what resilience was. And I was fundamentally against it. It doesn't sound like a social justice thing. And I guess through the arc of the project thus far, I've begun to get an appreciation of possibly a more clinical definition of resilience, being there have been participants in the research, not our participants, but participants in research who have already experienced adversity and yet have responded to that adversity differently. And me having to shift my perspective around what adversity might mean and what resilience might mean, I think is part of that process. Sometimes the mechanized nature of translational science means that it's too on the nose, in my opinion. We're going straight directly at something which doesn't manifest in the world in that way. So doing depression research where you walk up to someone and say, talk to me about your depression, might not garner the data that we need to make someone feel less depressed. And that might sound smoke and mirrors. It's not supposed to be that. It just means we need to be, all of us, I believe, need to be more creative in how we approach these problems. I've got to go and meet teachers in school and talk to them about their experience of having neurodivergent, dysregulated children in their class. It probably will be, I hope, the 10th question I ask them. Ask her after, what's it like to be a teacher in a classroom now? Not because I'm being disingenuous, but I think if we just go straight to the nub of it, it won't matter. The work won't have any traction and won't understand the nuance.
It reminds you of Nikki's point about butterflies and being light, and what you made, and or somehow and resilience. Not some ways, some researchers doing resilience research and ways of thinking about resilience research isn't empowering at all. Doesn't foster agency or autonomy or feeling good about it, but it reminds you of all the deficit problems. Good. Our time is up for this section. Thank you ever so much. 3 amazing talks. There's so much more we could say and so many more insights we could bring to this, and I hope we will. There will be infographics produced and additional work done. So thank you for that. I'll now move on to the next section, where we have 5 lightning talks. And they're going to be, I'm going to introduce all of the speakers at the beginning and then cue them one after the other. So there's Eamon Kanjo from the eNurture Computer Science Network, Professor of Mobility, Technology and Data Science. Professor Laura Vaughan from the Loneliness and Social Isolation Network, Bartlett School of Architecture. Arif Mahmood, Mental Health Research Matters Steering Group and the Emerging Minds Network. Fred Cooper, Loneliness and Social Isolation Mental Health Research Network, and Rosie Perkins, Music, Health and Social Science, also from the Loneliness and Social Isolation Network. Some of these talks are live, some are recorded, and there'll be a bit of time to reflect on them, I hope, afterwards as well. So Nikki, Kat, Sylvan, thanks ever so much. Stay on the call, because we'll bring you in later, hopefully, for the conversations. So to begin with, Ayman, over to you. Thank you so much for contributing and participating.
Thank you. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So I come from the extreme end of the spectrum. I'm an engineer, technologist, and computer scientist. So since I was a child, I always wanted to be an engineer who can develop hardware and software to improve people's lives. Over the years, I started looking at how can we utilize mobile phones to understand the world around us. I was one of the early academics to start programming mobile phones. Soon, I discovered that we can use mobile phones as sensors and connect them to external sensors too. So we started developing environmental tools to monitor the environment using phone microphones as noise monitors combined with GPS location tracking and mapping tools. Later, we developed a portable air quality monitor and so on. Along the way, we realized that in order to benefit from our research on the environment, we needed to start to look at the impact of the environment on health and well-being and measure both and see if we can assess the relationship and the correlational aspects. Step by step, I found myself working with collaborators from psychology, mental health experts, and clinicians, and more. We started to look at collecting behavior data, physiological, biometric, location, self-reported data, all fused together to understand users' behavior, wherever they are, whether they are doing their weekly shopping or walking in the park. We also looked extensively at modeling smartphone usage and the problematic usage and the impact on well-being. again, after some reflection period, we felt that we can't just stop there. We needed to act on that. And we wanted to act on the findings of our research and to utilize smart sensors, mobile phone, AI technology to improve well-being. And we started to move towards interventions, create interventions using engineering solutions. So, for example, the work that we did with nurture, including tangible toys for children to improve children's well-being, smart fidgeting cubes to tackle stress, our platform Tag With Me, which is a tech-based green social prescribing platform that is currently set up at a local mental health hospital here in Nottingham, and many, many other tools that we created over the years. Now, the second question that I've been given is to talk about the challenges that we face in terms of multidisciplinary work. So from computer science and engineering perspectives, one of the biggest challenges is that many people don't understand that engineers and technologists can make a huge impact on advancing mental health research, including in developing measurement and assessment tools in real time that can outperform paper-based methods by far. Second, they can create technology-based interventional solutions that can help in easing the pressure on NHS. And third, technologists are as committed to protecting users' privacy as any professional specialist. In fact, all the technologists and engineers that I know in academia are very creative and good at following co-design and co-creation methodologies. Now, in terms of my top tips for multidisciplinary working, improving someone's mental health can be more challenging than physical health because there are there are many hidden factors that mental health specialists might not know about. Also, the way that our brain works is not yet fully clear to scientists, and still a lot for us to learn. Therefore, clinicians alone can't cure mental health illnesses. It requires multidisciplinary approach. We started to look at using innovative engineering and technological solutions to help in understanding improving well-being. And we don't know which one of these can work, and we might fail a lot, but we have to try. Otherwise, if we don't try, we might deprive mental health patients of possible solutions that can or could improve their lives. And that's exactly on time.
Thank you ever so much. Gosh, that was there's so much in there. It was a very challenging. I know we set you a challenge really doing all of that in a few minutes. It's really appreciated, and we'll unpack that. And I guess my central question as you were speaking was, how do you get the embedded practice, the Zen and the pajamas into technology? You know, we can come back to that perhaps at the end. So thank you for that very much, and we'll call on you in the discussion. Shall we move on now? The next speaker is actually it's going to be the video that we're going to be seeing shortly. If George, you could be coordinating that and gives me a thumbs up when you're ready. So that gives us a minute or two, perhaps, just to carry on if you're happy to do so. I mean, just my comment about the Zen in technology. Is there a Zen space in technology? So you're on mute.
Sorry, because my line is breaking. I'm in a conference.
Oh, okay. So having set you a challenge, I'm making it even harder to. Yeah.
Because I'm part of another event, but I'm trying to listen.
All right. Okay, thank you ever so much. Yeah. So, are we ready for the video, George?
Hi, I'm Fred Cooper. I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter's Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. I'm a historian of medicine. I'm mostly interested in loneliness, solitude, mental health and shame. And I've collaborated quite widely with philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, literary scholars, and of course, other historians. Perhaps counterintuitively, working in this way has considerably sharpened my understanding of precisely what history as a discipline has to offer in the study of complex present-day health challenges. For me, problems like loneliness and mental illness require vast cross-disciplinary collaboration to even begin to unravel. and none of that is possible without history's distinct contribution, showing exactly why and how we are where we are. That said, multidisciplinary working can be awkward and difficult, and throws up a number of serious challenges for researchers, both individually and collectively. These could be methodological, practical, ideological, ethical, or interpersonal. As you might have guessed, I really like multidisciplinary work, but I also think we have to get away from what can sometimes be an almost fetishization of it as like an unclouded good, rather than something that frequently goes wrong and that has to be meticulously worked at. Before embarking on a collaboration, you have to ask some searching questions over whether your perspectives are actually compatible. You need some friction, some tension, but there should be agreement on significant intellectual or ideological points, and mutual respect for one another's work. Also very much worth mentioning are different expectations for what collaboration will actually look like in practice, and what kind of outputs will be most useful. More than anything else, these factors will govern the success or failure of the collaboration. Oddly, I've sometimes found this hardest to talk about, but you should really be able to articulate exactly what you do and don't want from something you give your time and expertise to. My top tip, if I have one, is to treat multidisciplinary work as a methodology in itself, with the main principle being communication. Is there a genuinely good basis for collaboration beyond the assumption that multidisciplinary research is a good thing to do? Why them? Why you? Why this? Have you set out expectations on theorization, contributions, authorship, and outcomes in close detail right from the start? If the answer to that's no, you could be sleepwalking into all kinds of problems. And do you feel able to revisit these questions and any others that arise as the collaboration progresses? Finally, if you're writing together, get a Google Doc and don't track changes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for the recording, George. Fred isn't here. We can't really put any reflections or questions to, but that was fascinating and again, a brutally honest account of some of the challenges that could be faced. Although I was surprised by the reticence, don't do something rather than explore it. But we can talk a bit more about that. So thank you for the video, and thank you, Fred, in your absence, and we'll connect up with you afterwards. So the next presentation, I think it's again a video, is Laura Vaughan. How are you doing there, George? So I'll just, if it's not, I'm just going to, okay, brilliant. Right.
My name's Laura Vaughan. I'm from the UCL Bartlett School of Architecture, and I'm a member of the Loneliness and Social Isolation in Mental Health Research Network at UCL. My interest in researching mental health stems from many years of research into how the design of where you live in towns and cities can influence social connections and also healthy activities such as walking. From this, it's been a natural step to be involved in a network on mental health and loneliness and social isolation, as we don't know enough about fundamental questions about how street design shapes, for example, social encounter and social connectivity. I've headed this talk with a quote from a recent book called The Urban Brain that refers to, quote, the tangles of biological, psychological, biographical, social and political forces that shape human mental life. As a spatial analytical expert, my interest in an interdisciplinary approach to studying mental health is in having the opportunity to make links with my scientific colleagues who range from psychiatrists to music therapists, as well as the third sector organisations we're connected to. And this was an essential part of this activity within the network. We used a variety of means to stimulate interactions across the disciplines, while also contributing to building capacity of people in the early stages of their careers through small grants for pilot projects, providing them with valuable research training, funding, visibility, and mentorship. The integration of research methodologies has been an especial success in our project. We now have a PhD student based in UCL's Department of Cardiovascular Science who is co-supervised by me in the School of Architecture. And a number of us have applied for collaborative research into how where you live can shape adolescent mental health and social isolation. Interdisciplinary research brings us strengths to subjects such as mental health and urban living, allowing us to contend with the complexity of the urban environment, both in its definition and in the myriad ways that it influences patterns of human life. In my own field, we've been battling with the tendency to reduce urban experience to subjective description and have thus developed instead ways of measuring spatial configuration or lived space, if you will, with much greater precision and objectivity. Yet there is a risk involved in reducing the urban experience to only those facts that are easily measurable, in ignoring those that are not, or when undertaking those measurements to forget one's own perspective on what counts, literally and figuratively. The urban environment is complex, as are the myriad ways that it influences patterns of human life. We therefore need a diverse set of methods, populations, and measures of healthy behaviours and health outcomes from the health sciences, and in the built environment disciplines, on the other hand, a consistent approach to measuring and characterising where we live. Agreeing on a common language, approaches, and research questions is essential for any interdisciplinary methodology. And I hope you will find these references of use for going onwards from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Laura for preparing that. Again, an amazing summary. Presumably we can share the references with delegates at a later point, making some really important points. We know mental illness is distributed geographically, non-randomly. We know cities are places where there's a higher incidence of all sorts of mental illnesses, but also there's less flourishing and challenging social experiences, poor housing and so on, and poor provision of services as well. So it's a really important presentation, and I certainly will be looking up some of those references to learn more about it. Our next lightning talk is Arif Mahmood, who's at Roehampton, a senior researcher, and interestingly, interested to hear more about this, Arif. You've said you don't fit into any discipline, and you therefore reflect on being a multidisciplinary researcher in a different sort of way. So it'll be really interesting to hear your thoughts about that. Far away.
Thank you so much, Cam, and thank you so much for inviting me for this panel. So we've been asked to prepare a quick talk on, what drew us to working in mental health research, the challenges for multidisciplinary working, and some top tips. So, what drew me to mental health research is that it's so pervasive in all of our lives, whether it's individual to ourselves or our loved ones, our colleagues, or just someone we meet in passing in our society and communities. Mental health and well-being is rooted in all aspects of our lives. And so my research interest, like many others, stemmed from my personal connections. I've got young kids, and I see them struggling with having, one best friend one day, and then the same best friend the next day is their worst friend. So the impacts of relationship skills. And my young nieces, as an educationalist, I always come from an educational stance. So my young nieces and nephews struggling with anxiety and stress for their Key Stage 2 or GCSE exams. But also on the other side of that, I see my elderly parents and other elderly family members struggling to keep up with such a fast-paced society, struggling to keep connected with these developing technologies, and obviously the current living crisis. So it's just everywhere. And for me, particularly, my interest and passion stem in supporting those with similar identity markers of, for example, coming from an ethnic minoritized group, or being Muslim in an ever-growing Islamophobic society. Unfortunately, the experiences of support for those from minoritized and disadvantaged backgrounds, looking at them in an intersectional way, is somewhat overlooked in mental health research, in educational research, and even less so through multidisciplinary lenses. So some of the challenges of working in a multidisciplinary working, and I agree with lots of everything that's been said so far. But for me personally speaking, I think there's a fear, or uneasiness of the unknown. For example, myself, I don't know how the dentistry discipline operates, for example, or the epistemological positionings of those from geology, or the methodological approaches of computer engineering. I might, maybe you can tell us about a little bit more about that. But so we need to be a bit more open-minded, open to change, open to listening. And as Nicola mentioned earlier, about really embracing this uncomfortableness, and understanding and recognizing that other disciplines, fields, subjects have these really amazing skill sets and different ways of problem solving, and then these different perspectives can result in some really innovative and interesting work that can support the development of mental health research. And I just wanted to add, parallel to all that, I think another challenge, and Cam, you said it's a dirty word earlier, but this notion of power and this relinquishing of power. It's a big challenge, the power of our thoughts, our privileges, our practices. And it's very difficult to relinquish and compromise some of this power, even if it is for the greater good. So, you know, a mixture of these challenges of, you know, stepping out of our comfort zones, being more open-minded, and subsequently relinquishing our power. Some of my top tips, again, some really great top tips being presented here, so I'm not sure I can add anything much more novel, but if I were to give a tip to myself, you know, first and foremost, as an early career researcher, I just tell myself that, you know, all of these things are not going to happen overnight. I think we need to make small yet continuous, you know, baby steps towards change. You know, whether that's by engaging with something outside of our discipline and area. It could be simply things like attending online events or listening to YouTube videos or podcasts, or even, you know, following someone different on social media. You know, really baby steps. And I don't mean it for us in this room. You know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here tonight, but it needs to happen. And again, I know it's spoken about before, you know, but from top down. So, you know, our glorious leaders in the government to, you know, the different yet very individual funding councils. And I know, Cam, you did a really great blog post for McPin about funding councils and how they need to embrace multidisciplinary work. And even, you know, senior leadership teams in universities and health services. So there needs to be a systematic restructure to develop a multi-disciplinary approach. And I honestly believe that through these baby steps, they'll lead to, you know, bigger outcomes, and, you know, they'll lead to having conversations, developing collaborations, and potentially carving out niches and making new spaces, hopefully at, you know, at micro research and practice level, but also at wider policy level too as well. So thank you so much. That was a lightning talk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I so resonate with what you're saying, particularly in the vocabularies and the uncomfortableness and the fear sometimes and uncertainty of working across disciplines. Like you, I'm working at the moment in a network on equality, and I'm talking to physicists, chemists, cell biologists. They don't deal with people at all. It's all in the lab, you know, and I'm constantly struggling to work out why they're so excited about measuring particles in the air, you know, and they're probably wondering why I'm so excited about what I do. And so it's an interesting choreography, I suppose. But you really touched on some of the structural issues, didn't you? That we've talked about stigma, but we haven't talked about hostility and prejudice of a more unpleasant nature, and how we need to change the structures in which we exist, and therefore transform those structures into something different. I'll invite Eamon back if she's still able to join us, and hopefully Kat and Sylvan and Nikki are still available, so that we can continue a conversation. I don't have any more questions on the chatters at the moment, but if you do have them, please send them in. We've got a few more minutes yet. But reflections, guys, Sylvan, Nikki, Kat, on those talks that we've had.
I think, Arif, what spoke to me in your presentation was about admitting and making visible these things. I think those oppressive structures that are adjacent to, but more powerful. I'm talking about racism and sexism and those other oppressive processes are so, I think I mentioned, are so infused in society. We have to accept that as an absolute in our research, and not have it as an elephant in the room. And we have to, my top tip is go into any interdisciplinary conversation with humility and an appreciation for the people who are in the room, who, if they're counting particles in the air and you're doing something else, you may not need to understand why they're doing it, but you need to understand Do they think it's significant? And from that standpoint, then a basis for dialogue may start. But the dialogue, we've established a term in ReSEDAR which is called violently agreeing, because that's how we're discovering that we're doing stuff. I'll say something, and then one of my colleagues, Edmund Snugabart, will say something else, and I realise we're actually saying the same thing from completely different ways.
It also speaks to time, doesn't it? That you need some space and time, and to sit and talk and to really listen and understand whether you are talking about something different or it's the same issue, but from a different perspective, with a different sensibility, with different sensory tools, if you like, and sensory experiences.
I think one point that really struck me was the point about sort of thinking about why you're doing interdisciplinary research and when it's appropriate and when it may not be, and sort of what question you're trying to answer. And sometimes that can take a little bit of discussion to work out what that is. Like in our development of the data prize, for example, we knew that there was something in the space around existing data, creating, a space for data scientists and mental health scientists to work together. But it took us quite a long time to kind of work out what sort of question could we ask that could be actually meaningful to both groups, and that by working together, you could develop a solution that's greater than any discipline working on its own. And that's why we ended up with this sort of double research question. But I think that's so important. We don't want to mandate people working together just for the sake of it, to tick a box. It has to really sort of meaningfully advance, our overall vision and mission.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because it does take a lot more time to do interdisciplinary research, and it's not always the right approach. It's certainly the right approach to tackling complex problems, but sometimes you do need to, if you need a quick fix, you just need to get a disciplinary expert in to do that bit and come. So sometimes you do have to be quite strategic. I was very struck by how pictures and actions can speak so much louder than words sometimes. In all of the presentations, that's been something that's been very, very powerful. It's another way in which creative practices are being used across disciplines. So I was just very, very aware of that, and admiring some of when Sylvan was saying about labs and the fact that this project that Cam, Sylvan and I are working on, there's going to be this thing that we're calling living labs, and they're understood differently in different disciplines. But actually the theatre laboratory, as Sylvan said, and the science laboratory are not dissimilar. And I'm always really impressed by how creative the thinking is of some of my science colleagues. That's probably because I brought all sorts of stereotypes to thinking, well, scientists aren't creative. They're incredibly creative and artistic. And I think and hope that maybe I might be starting to think a bit more like a scientist now, but Cam will be the judge of that at the end of our project.
I wouldn't want to do that to you, Nikki. But it reminds me of very different traditions of research and what research is, and I think we don't interrogate that enough. What do we mean by research? So one of the values of interdisciplinary work, I think, is it brings experiences and makes them far more visible and important in the central activity of research. Whatever you do around those experiences is different. And engineers and technologists do this. They do design thinking and design work. They don't try and get an answer which they can fix the world with in 3 years. They know this is a long journey, so they're quite happy to take small steps and do what's useful and solves a problem. And that's how we solved COVID, and that's how we got to the moon. A bunch of people got together and solved the problem, but we've gone to reaching for answers, I think, very quickly. And we know that over 70% of trials in mental health research turned out to be negative and unhelpful, and we haven't made that many advances. So this has to be the way forward, really, is to have conversations that we've not had and do things in a way that we've never done them before. And Eamon's commented in the chat that she hopes and dreams that the tech approach, the design approach, will flatten the power hierarchies that we're currently struggling with. And so that's a thing I think we could all sign up to. Any final closing comments from you amazing, brilliant people?
I'm going to jump in, Cam. I think there are two potential approaches that you've alluded to there. One is what I call the Apollo 13 paradigm, which is the scene I remember from the movie. I hope it's true. Is that someone having discovered that the capsule was broken and they were losing air, someone downstairs in the NASA labs got the list of all of the equipment that was on the module, got that stuff and took it into a room, slammed it on the table and said, how do we make an air filter out of this? And I don't know whether that's an interdisciplinary approach, but it's an approach which is really clear about what the context and the parameters are. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that's my tip. Be clear about where the boundaries are, be clear about what the immutables are, and understand the politics that sits around that. And then maybe you're in the space to have a conversation. Yeah, brilliant. Any other final comments? So the bit that we didn't get more into, but maybe we can reflect on and converse about later, is really, this is really hard work, isn't it? It takes a lot of courage and energy. And again, that doesn't get factored into it. We put into the, we anticipate there's going to be some intellectual work, but all this activity requires so much patience and personal and emotional investment and time and disappointments, and you've alluded to that, and some of the presenters alluded to that. There are disappointments, there are going to be disagreements, there are things that we are strained by, and our identities are strained and our roles are strained. And if we're not used to that, we're not flexible enough, it becomes a real challenge to our own survival. And the structures around us, of course, have created a situation which we're trying to perform to particular premises and premises of worth and value and outcome and output, sort of thing, which maybe we're now redefining completely. So getting the values and the processes right is probably far more important than thinking about the outcome in research. And this is a major contribution you've all made to progressing that sort of thinking in mental health care. So we're slightly over time. Thank you all again for an amazing, amazing webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it as presenters, and I hope the audience have enjoyed it. Please do give feedback to the team, and I hope we'll continue, and I know we'll continue working and talking on these issues. So really appreciate it. Have a lovely evening. Thank you for joining us.